The deadliest shipwreck in the history of the Great Lakes killed more passengers than the Titanic. Its victims were mostly women and children. And the ship never even left the dock. It rolled over onto its side in a downtown river, in the heart of a great American city, in front of thousands of horrified onlookers, in a matter of minutes. 844 people died, a few feet from dry land. And today, almost no one remembers it happened. This is the story of the SS Eastland, and of the 24th of July, 1915, a bright summer morning that turned, in the space of a few minutes, into one of the worst disasters in American history. It is a story of a top-heavy ship, a well-meaning safety law that backfired horribly, and a working-class immigrant community that was gutted before its day trip even began. This is below. It was meant to be the happiest day of the year. The Western Electric Company, whose vast Hawthorne works on the edge of Chicago employed tens of thousands of people, held an annual summer picnic for its workers and their families. For a single day, ordinary factory hands, clerks, and their children could dress in their Sunday best and sail across Lake Michigan to a day of games, food, and music. For the immigrant families who made up so much of that workforce, this was a rare and precious treat. Many were Czech and Bohemian, Polish and other newcomers, living in the tight working-class neighborhoods of Cicero and Berwyn. They had come to America for a better life and worked long, hard weeks. The company picnic was their reward, and whole families had been looking forward to it for months. And so, in the early morning of the 24th of July, thousands of them streamed down to the Chicago River in the heart of downtown, dressed up and full of excitement. Several steamers had been chartered to carry the crowd across the lake to Michigan City, Indiana. The first and grandest of them, tied up along the south bank of the river between two bridges, was the Eastland. On paper, the Eastland was a fine ship. She was fast and handsome, and had been marketed with the proud slogan that in all the world there was no trip like this. But among those who knew ships, the Eastland carried a darker reputation. She was known to be tender, unstable, top-heavy. On more than one earlier occasion, she had listed alarmingly, tipping to one side in a way that had frightened passengers and crew alike. This was not some new, unforeseeable flaw. From early in her career, the Eastland had shown a frightening tendency to lean. More than once, years before, she had listed so badly with passengers aboard that people panicked and boarding had to be stopped. There had even been written warnings that, one day, under the wrong conditions, she might roll completely over. The warnings were filed away. The ship kept sailing. And here enters one of the cruelest ironies in maritime history. Just 3 years earlier, the Titanic had sunk, largely because it did not carry enough lifeboats for the people aboard. In the wave of reform that followed, new laws demanded that passenger ships carry many more lifeboats and rafts. It was a well-intentioned rule, born of a real tragedy, meant to save lives. But on a ship like the Eastland, already top-heavy and unstable, the fix became part of the trap. To comply with the new law, extra lifeboats and heavy rafts had been added to her upper decks. All that additional weight, high up, raised the ship's center of gravity and made an already tippy vessel even more dangerous. The precautions meant to prevent another Titanic were quietly setting the stage for a different kind of catastrophe. The physics is unforgiving. A ship stays upright because its weight sits low, giving it the tendency to right itself whenever it leans. Pile weight up high, lifeboats, heavy rafts, and crowds of people on the top deck, and you steadily eat away at that stability. Push it far enough, and the ship reaches a tipping point from which it simply cannot recover. That July morning, the Eastland was being loaded straight toward that point. That morning, the passengers came aboard in a great, cheerful flood. The Eastland was licensed to carry something on the order of 2,500 people, and that morning she was loaded right up toward that limit. The decks filled with families, the crowd thick and happy, many of them heading up to the top deck to wave at the shore and enjoy the view. And it was that crowding, high on the ship, that began to tell. The trouble began within minutes of boarding. By around 7:10, with passengers still streaming aboard, the ship was already leaning. The crew scrambled to pump water between her ballast tanks to level her, flooding one side and then the other. But the ballast system was slow, and the shifting, cheerful crowd was faster. Every attempt to correct one list seemed only to set up a worse one in the other direction. Almost as soon as the loading began, the Eastland started to misbehave. Still tied firmly to the dock, she began to list, leaning first toward the wharf, then away from it, toward the open river. The crew tried to correct her by shifting her water ballast, but they were fighting a losing battle against all that top weight and all those people. The list grew worse. Water began to lap toward the open lower portholes, many of which had been left open on the warm morning. Those open portholes would prove fatal. As the ship leaned toward the river, the lower row of them dipped closer and closer to the water. The instant they slipped beneath the surface, the river began pouring into the hull through dozens of open windows at once, and whatever slim chance the ship still had of righting herself was gone. She was now taking on water low down, in exactly the place that would finish her. And then, at around 7:30 in the morning, with more than 2,000 people aboard, the Eastland reached the point of no return. Slowly at first, and then with terrible finality, she rolled over onto her port side, away from the dock, and settled into the river. She did not sink beneath deep water. She simply lay down on her side in barely 20 feet of water, right there against the wharf, in the middle of the city. From the first serious list to the final roll, the whole thing unfolded in less than half an hour, and the capsize itself took only moments. There was no time to organize an evacuation, no drill, no orderly retreat to the boats. One moment families were chatting on the decks. The next, the deck had become a wall, and then a ceiling, and the warm summer river was rushing in over everything and everyone. For the people on the upper, open side, many were thrown or scrambled clear, tumbling into the river or onto the exposed hull. But for the hundreds who were below decks, or on the side that went into the water, it was a nightmare almost beyond describing. In an instant, their world turned 90 degrees. Water flooded in through the open portholes and doors. Furniture, and even a piano, are said to have slid across the decks, crushing people as the ship went over. Hundreds of passengers, disproportionately the women and children who had gathered in the more sheltered inner areas, were trapped inside the hull as it filled with river water. They drowned in the dark, below the surface, only a few meters from a crowded dock in broad daylight. It was less like a shipwreck at sea than like a building collapsing full of people, in the middle of a city. The randomness of who lived and who died was its own cruelty. Some who had already stepped off onto the dock, or who arrived a few minutes late, survived by pure chance. Among those who narrowly missed the Eastland that day was a young man named George Hallis, who would go on to help found the National Football League. A slow morning, a missed connection, and a person lived. A moment the other way, and they did not. And that is the detail that makes the Eastland so uniquely horrifying. This did not happen far out on a stormy lake. It happened at the wharf, in the calm river, downtown, with thousands of people watching from the banks and the bridges. Rescuers were there in seconds. Workers from nearby buildings dove in. And still, right in front of the city, hundreds of people were dying inside a ship they could almost reach out and touch. What followed was a frantic, desperate rescue. Men scrambled onto the exposed steel hull, now lying flat above the water, and began cutting holes through it with torches to reach the people trapped inside. Rescuers pulled survivors, and then bodies, out through the openings. Boats, ropes, ladders, anything that could help, converged on the river. But for most of those trapped below, help came far too late. Ordinary people became heroes in those minutes. Dockworkers and passers-by dove in again and again. A young man remembered afterward as the human frog is said to have pulled body after body from the water until he collapsed from exhaustion. Welders cut through the steel hull as trapped passengers banged on it from the inside. But for every person dragged out alive, others could be heard within, and then, terribly, could not. The living were hauled onto the dock, soaked and in shock. And then came the terrible business of the dead. Bodies were laid out along the riverbank in rows. As the scale became clear, the city commandeered a nearby armory as a temporary morgue, and grieving families filed past hundreds of victims, searching for husbands, wives, sons, and daughters who, hours earlier, had left home dressed for a picnic. A nearby armory was turned into a vast, grim hall of the dead, with rows upon rows of bodies laid out for identification. For 2 days, a heartbroken procession of families moved slowly through it. Some found everyone they had lost. Some found no one at all, because every relative who could have identified them was also gone. The city had never seen grief on such a scale, delivered so suddenly, to so many, all at once. When the counting was done, the toll was staggering. 844 people had died. The overwhelming majority were passengers, ordinary working families, and a heartbreaking number of them were women and children. In terms of passengers lost, it was worse than the Titanic. It remains the deadliest single disaster in the history of the Great Lakes, and one of the deadliest in American history. It is worth being precise about the comparison. The Titanic killed more people in total, because it carried a large crew. But in terms of passengers, the paying travelers who stepped aboard expecting a journey, the Eastland's toll was even higher. More passengers died in that shallow Chicago River than died in the freezing North Atlantic aboard the most famous ship in the world. And the loss fell with brutal concentration on those immigrant neighborhoods. Because this was a company picnic, entire families had come together, and so entire families were wiped out together. In the Czech and Bohemian communities of Cicero and Berwyn especially, the grief was total. 22 families are said to have been erased completely, every member gone in a single morning. Whole blocks went into mourning at once. In the neighborhoods around the Hawthorne Works, the funerals ran for days. On some streets, services were held almost house to house. A community of immigrants who had crossed an ocean to build a new life found itself burying its own children by the dozen, a wound those neighborhoods would carry for generations, even as the wider country quickly moved on and forgot. In the years that followed, there were investigations, inquests, and lawsuits that dragged on for decades. Blame was argued over endlessly: the ship's unstable design, the added lifeboats, the overcrowding, the crew's handling of the ballast. But in the end, remarkably, no one was ever held criminally responsible for the deaths of 844 people. The legal system churned for years and delivered, essentially, no one to punish. The legal aftermath was its own quiet scandal. Lawsuits over the disaster ground through the courts for some 20 years, and when they were finally resolved, the owner's liability was sharply limited, and the families of the dead received almost nothing. In the end, the law protected the people who had run the ship far better than it had ever protected the people who boarded her. The Eastland herself was eventually raised from the river, pumped out, and repaired. In a strange second act, she was sold to the United States Navy and rebuilt as a training vessel, renamed the Wilmette. She served quietly for decades, most people aboard her never knowing the horror in her past, before she was finally scrapped in the 1940s. The ship survived. Most of her passengers had not. So why has almost no one heard of the Eastland, when everyone knows the Titanic? Part of the answer is timing. The Titanic had sunk just 3 years before, and had seized the world's imagination as the ultimate tragedy of the age. Only months before the Eastland, a German torpedo had sunk the Lusitania. And the whole world was consumed by the First World War then raging across Europe. A disaster on a river in Chicago, however terrible, struggled to hold the headlines. There was also class at work in the forgetting. The Titanic carried millionaires and celebrities, and their glamour helped burn its story into memory. The Eastland carried immigrant factory workers, Czechs and Poles and their children, people without famous names or powerful voices. Their deaths were just as real, and more numerous in passengers, but the world has always found it easier to remember its tragedies when the victims are rich. There is a strange postscript to it all. That same Hawthorne works would later become famous in an entirely different field, as the site of experiments that gave us the term the Hawthorne effect, the idea that people change their behavior when they know they are being watched. The factory is remembered, in textbooks, for a footnote in psychology, and almost never for the hundreds of its own people who died on their day off. And at the very center of it sits that cruel, unforgettable irony. A law written to prevent another Titanic, by forcing ships to carry more lifeboats, helped tip an already unstable vessel onto its side, and killed more passengers than the Titanic did, at a dock, in calm water, without ever leaving the city. The lifeboats meant to save lives became part of what took them. In the days that followed, hard-hat divers descended into the sunken hull again and again, working in the murky river to recover the last of the bodies from the flooded compartments. It was slow, gruesome, and dangerous work, carried out in near darkness among the belongings of the dead. Only when they were finally certain that no one remained inside did that grim task come to an end. It is a pattern that should sound familiar to anyone who studies disasters. A tragedy prompts a fix. The fix is applied without fully understanding the system it changes. And the fix itself sets up the next catastrophe. Safety is not a simple matter of adding more equipment. On the Eastland, more of a good thing, high on a bad ship, turned out to be lethal. The Eastland had been built for speed and for the shallow harbors of the Great Lakes, with a hull that made her fast but inherently tender. Over the years she had been modified again and again, each change adding weight or height, until her margin of safety had been whittled down to almost nothing. She was, in truth, an accident waiting for the one day she would be crowded enough to happen. But strip away the ironies and the lessons, and what remains is the human core of it. Thousands of tired working people, many of them immigrants who had crossed an ocean for a better life, put on their best clothes for one bright day of joy. And within an hour of boarding, before the trip had even begun, more than 800 of them were dead in a river, within sight of the shore. Think of the children especially. Dressed up, excited, clutching a parent's hand, boarding a great ship for a summer adventure. Many of them never made it off the dock alive. It is that image, more than any statistic, that ought to keep the Eastland from being forgotten, the sheer, ordinary, heartbreaking humanity of who was lost, and how little it took to lose them. Today there is a modest marker near the spot on the Chicago River where it happened, and a dedicated few who work to keep the memory alive. But for a disaster of this magnitude, the silence is deafening. The Eastland should be a household name, spoken in the same breath as the Titanic and the Lusitania. Instead it is a footnote, if that. So remember it now. Remember that the worst day in the history of the Great Lakes was not a storm or a collision far out on the water. It was a crowd of working families in their Sunday best, boarding a top-heavy ship for a company picnic, and dying by the hundreds against a downtown wharf, on a calm summer morning, before the voyage had even begun. Below exists for exactly these stories, the disasters beneath the surface of history, the wrecks and the drownings the world has chosen to forget. If you want more of them, the famous, the forgotten, and the ones that should never have happened, subscribe and stay with us. This has been Below.